Rwanda, one of the poorest countries on earth, has a higher percentage of women in parliament than Sweden, Norway, and the United States combined. That is not a coincidence. That is a policy decision. And it tells you something profound about what happens when a country has nothing left to lose. Here's what the data actually shows. The nations spending the least money per citizen are, in several measurable ways, spending it better. Not in all ways, not without suffering, but in ways that wealthy governments, bloated, bureaucratic, and politically captured, simply cannot replicate. This is a story of what poor countries do with money that rich countries don't. And by the end of this video, you will question everything you thought you knew about development, efficiency, and who is actually learning from whom. Most people believe the world of money works like a ladder. Rich countries at the top, sophisticated, efficient, innovative. Poor countries at the bottom, dependent, wasteful, waiting for aid. That is the assumption. Here's the reality. The World Bank tracks 189 economies. In 14 of the last 20 years, the fastest growing economies on Earth were in sub-Saharan Africa, not Europe, not North America. Africa, and it's not just growth, it's method, mobile money, pioneered in Kenya, is now being studied and replicated by financial regulators in Germany and the UK. Ethiopia's industrial policy, state-directed, deliberately protectionist, is achieving export manufacture results that Western economists spent 3 decades saying were impossible in that environment. The mechanism that creates the gap between what people assume and what is actually happening is simple and brutal. Rich countries have the luxury of inefficiency. They can afford to be slow, wasteful, and politically paralyzed because their baseline is so high that the damage is absorbed. Poor countries have no such cushion. Every dollar must work. And that necessity, that constraint, has produced strategies that the wealthy world is only now beginning to understand. We are not here to romanticize poverty. Poverty is catastrophic. But inside that catastrophe, something unexpected is being built. Let's start with a number. $1.86 trillion. That is a combined annual budget of the United States federal government's social spending programs, Medicaid, food stamps, housing assistance, the entire welfare apparatus. Adjusted per recipient, the U.S. spends roughly $9,400 per person in poverty per year. Now consider this. Kenya's M-Pesa mobile money system moved $314 billion in transactions in 2023, in a country where the GDP per capita is under $2,100. That is 150% of GDP flowing through a system that did not exist 17 years ago, built by a telecom company, not a government, because the banking sector had failed an entire population and someone had to act. The central player in this story is not a billionaire or president. It is a constraint itself. When Safaricom launched M-Pesa in 2007, the Kenyan government's initial instinct was to regulate it out of existence. Traditional banks lobbied hard. The Central Bank of Kenya convened committees. The World Bank wrote cautious reports. And while everyone argued, 40 million Kenyans, farmers, market vendors, domestic workers, adopted it in under a decade because it solved a problem no one else was solving. The opposing force was the entire architecture of formal finance, which had decided, explicitly, that poor rural Africans were not worth the infrastructure cost. Safaricom's motivation was commercial survival. They needed a product that would retain subscribers on network with razor-thin margins. The accidental result was the most sophisticated financial inclusion system on the planet. Here is the secondary fact that changes everything. According to MIT economists Tavneet Suri and William Jack, M-Pesa lifted 194,000 Kenyan households, approximately 2% of the country, out of poverty. Not aid, not loans, a phone-based money transfer app, and its primary beneficiaries were women. The UK's financial regulator, the FCA, published a 2022 report quietly acknowledging that Britain's own fintech framework was structurally modeled on Kenyan mobile money principles. They just didn't say it loudly. The conventional story is this. Poor countries lack money, so they lack infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Foreign aid fills the gap. Development follows. This is what every textbook says. The data tells a different story. The global aid system has transferred approximately $5 trillion to developing nations since 1960, according to the OECD. In that same period, Africa's share of global manufacturing has declined from 3% in 1980 to under 2% today. The money came. The structural development did not. Here's what most analysts miss. The reason poor countries sometimes deploy capital more effectively is not despite their poverty. It is because of their institutional youth. Rich countries carry the dead weight of legacy systems. The United States still uses paper checks. Germany still relies on fax machines in government offices. In 2024, federal agencies sent over 15 million faxes. France's tax system runs partly on software built in the 1980s. Poor countries, by contrast, build on top of nothing. They leapfrog. Rwanda didn't build landlines and then upgrade to fiber. It went straight to 4G towers and drone delivery networks for blood products. Today, Zipline's drone system delivers 35% of all blood products outside Rwanda's capital. The NHS in Britain is still negotiating contracts to pilot something similar in Wales. Ethiopia built the continent's largest industrial park, the Hawassa Industrial Park, in 18 months. Compare that to the UK's HS2 rail project. 14 years of planning, $100 billion over budget, and still unfinished. The constraint forces speed. The comfort breeds delay. This is not just about infrastructure. It is about political economy. Rich countries have interest groups that protect inefficiency. Agricultural subsidies in the European Union, 57 billion euros per year, keep food prices artificially high globally, which directly undercuts the export revenue of sub-Saharan African farmers. The EU simultaneously sends development aid to those same countries. It is, in measurable financial terms, taking money from Africa with one hand and returning a fraction of it with the other while calling this development partnership. Meanwhile, countries like Bangladesh, GDP per capita of $2,700, have reduced child mortality faster than virtually any comparable economy in history. Between 1990 and 2020, Bangladesh cut under 5 child mortality by 82%. The method: community health workers, oral rehydration salts, and political will. No expensive hospital systems. No imported pharmaceutical frameworks. Constraint-driven, evidence-based, and brutally cheap. Why should you care? Because the assumptions embedded in the phrase developing world are now costing your government money. Western governments are spending billions studying and attempting to replicate what low-income nations build out of necessity. The World Bank's ID4D program, digital identity infrastructure, is modeled on India's Aadhaar system, which enrolled 1.4 billion people at a cost of approximately $1 per person. The UK's equivalent digital identity scheme has cost over £500 million and enrolled a fraction of that. The gap is no longer just about who has money. It is about who is learning from whom. And right now, the learning is flowing in a direction that most people find deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. Here is the twist. This entire video, you've been watching a story about what poor countries do differently, about leapfrogging, efficiency, constraint-driven innovation. But that is not actually what this story is about. This story is about what wealth does to decision-making. The reason rich countries cannot replicate what Bangladesh, Kenya, or Rwanda have built is not technical. It is not even financial. It is because wealth, institutional wealth, political wealth, legacy wealth, creates constituencies for the status quo. Every inefficiency in a rich country system is somebody's income. Every bloated procurement process is somebody's contract. Every legacy software system is somebody's job. Poor countries innovate not because they are virtuous. They innovate because they have no lobby for the existing system. There is no guild of fax machine maintenance engineers in Kigali. There is no agricultural subsidy block protecting Rwandan farmers from competition. There is just a problem and a desperate need to solve it with whatever is at hand. The real winner in this story is not the poor country. It is the idea that constraints, genuine, non-negotiable constraints, are the most powerful force in human problem solving. And the most dangerous thing that can happen to any institution, any country, any individual, is the removal of all constraints. Because the moment you can afford to be inefficient, you will be. The question this video is really asking is not, what do poor countries do differently? It is, what are rich countries refusing to do because they can afford not to? And that question applies to you, personally, as well. The most innovative periods of most people's lives are the ones with the fewest resources. We started with Rwanda, a country that emerged from genocide in 1994 with a destroyed economy, 800,000 dead, and no institutional infrastructure. A country that had, in the most literal sense, nothing. Today, Rwanda has the highest proportion of women in national government on earth, 61%. It has a functioning national drone delivery system for medical supplies. Its capital, Kigali, consistently ranks as the cleanest and least corrupt city in sub-Saharan Africa. Its GDP has grown an average of 7.5% per year for 2 decades. None of that was built with abundance. All of it was built with constraint. Wealth does not make governments smarter. It makes them slower, more captured, and more committed to the systems that made them wealthy in the first place. And the countries we call developing are, in several measurable and important ways, developing faster than us. But here's a question that this story refuses to answer, and that no one in mainstream economics wants to address directly. If constraint is the engine of innovation, what happens when developing countries stop being poor? What happens when Kenya has legacy systems to protect? What happens when Rwanda's government has constituencies to appease? Does innovation stop? Or does something else, something we haven't seen yet, take its place? That is the story nobody is telling. And it is coming faster than most governments, rich or poor, are prepared for.